Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Fish Bat Chat. Today I will be talking about the differences between Kings of War and Warhammer Fantasy battles. I want to talk about this because there are quite a few differences between the games, and players interested in moving from Warhammer Fantasy to Kings of War might want to know a little bit more about the game, and perhaps might see some of the differences as being negative. While I don't think the Kings of War is a strictly superior game, I do think that by and large a lot of the differences are either positive or make a lot of sense within the context of what Kings of War is trying to achieve. So I'm going to be doing two main things. First, I'm going to list the main differences between the games. And second, I'm going to defend the differences in Kings of War. Let's start with the biggest difference between the two systems: stat lines and units. In Warhammer Fantasy, each individual model has its own line of statistics, which you can see on the left here, the example being Dwarven Hammerers. In Kings of War, by contrast, each unit, each combined block of soldiers moving and fighting together, has its own line of statistics, which you can see on the right here for the Dwarven Ironclads. This is quite a difference. In Warhammer Fantasy, you could easily, on a large table, have 200 models on one side. All of them, well, a lot of them would share similar statistics, but even within a unit, you would have, say, 20 guys, one of them would have a banner, one of them would have an instrument, another one would be a champion, which would have a special piece of gear, say a special sword, perhaps a gem that has some sort of magical effect, and there could also be a hero in the unit as well. So by Kings of War having just one stat for that entire block really simplifies that process. There's only one thing you need to look for everything there. So that is one of the most immediate and noticeable differences between the two systems. I'll discuss a little bit more about the differences in the way units are structured a bit later, as in that the footprint of the unit matters rather than the number of individual models there. But moving on to the individual statistics, we can see with the Warhammer stat line, starting from the left, we have M for movement. This is analogous to SP, speed, in Kings of War. Then WS, weapon skill. This is analogous to ME, melee, and reflects the capacity of the unit to hit what's in front of it in melee. In Warhammer Fantasy, we all know that this is used on a table. You compare the attacker's weapon skill to the defender's weapon skill, and that will then tell you on the table what roll you'll need to hit. Whereas in Kings of War, you are directly told what you need to hit, irrespective of your opponent. There are opponents in the game that can modify this, say ones with the ensnare special rule, but almost always you will simply use that roll. This removes another step in the whole process. You don't need to look anything up, you simply roll it. Likewise, you have Ballistic Skill, which is analogous to ranged. The Ironclads here don't have range attack, and if it did, it would probably hit on a 5+, but the same principle holds. Well, technically with Ballistic Skill there is a table, but you don't really need to look at it. You simply subtract Ballistic Skill from 7, and that's the dice roll you need to hit. It's just that with Kings of War, it's more obvious and straightforward. For example, saying that 5+ means you need to hit on a 5+ is far more intuitive than something like BS3 means I hit on a 4. The Kings of War system is just more intuitive in this case. The next statistic is strength. There is no strength in Kings of War as such. If you have a high strength, you instead get a special rule rather than regular statistic. The special rule is called crushing strength. So everything is assumed to have a general baseline of average strength, unless notified otherwise. Then you might get crushing strength 1, 2, or 3, which will lower the defense of the enemy by the appropriate amount, and I'll speak about defense right now. So, in Warhammer Fantasy we have toughness and wounds. Toughness being what strength is compared to, in order to decide what dice roll is appropriate in Warhammer Fantasy, and wounds being the amount of damage each individual model can take before it carks it and has to be removed from the table. In Kings of War this has been consolidated. Instead of having to compare anything, you simply look at the defense rating of the unit you're hitting. So if anything was attacking these ironclads, after hitting them they would look at the defense, and the defense says 5+. So any roll of a 5+ would then cause a damage. If they had a rule like crushing strength, this would function similarly to having a high strength in Warhammer. You would lower the defense of the unit by 1, so something with crushing strength 1 attacking the ironclads would damage them on a 4+. This seems an elegant system to me as well, and it just makes the whole thing flow really easily. Then in Warhammer we have initiative. This is gone entirely, and as I'll explain in another slide, there is no combat each way and around. In Warhammer, there's a charge, two sides are in combat, whoever has the higher initiative attacks first, then the other side attacks back. Not so in Kings of War. On your turn, you fight. On their turn, they fight. That's it. So no initiative. Then attacks. Well, as noted before, in Warhammer each model has an attack. In Kings of War, the unit has attacks. And so, in a combat, in Warhammer, you'll have to look at which models are in contact with the enemy, which models are a rank behind the ones in contact with the enemy, which ones are diagonal, and if you have a champion that might have an extra attack or special weapons or anything like that. No such concern in Kings of War, you simply look at the attack statistic. It does get modified. For example, if you attack an enemy from the flank, you double your attacks. Attack from the rear, you triple them. But this is incredibly obvious when you do so. So we've all known those situations in Warhammer where we've had to bend over and there's 3 units in contact and you're sort of squinting at your guys trying to work out, okay, do I have 7 or 8 who are in contact, and how many are in the first rank, how many are in the second, so how many attacks is that? Doesn't exist in Kings of War. So again, another step that makes the whole process smooth as butter. Then we get to leadership. Leadership and wounds, it's all consolidated. In Kings of War, your morale is analogous to the damage you take in some ways. Because as a unit takes damage, they are also less likely to want to stick around and fight. So, when you attack an enemy, you roll to hit with your melee score, you roll to damage them, which is to roll their defense score, and then after that, you roll to see if they're going to be destroyed, or if they're going to waver. So you can see that nerve statistic there on the right. For a troop that is a size of 10 ironclads, they have a nerve of 10/12. That is, if you roll 2d6, roll 2 dice, add the numbers together, and then add the number of damage that unit has taken. You'll know how much they've taken because you'll have recorded it with markers. If it's over the first value, they're wavering. If it's over the second value, they've routed. Wavering means that they're indecisive, they can't do anything the next turn, they're not going to charge you back, they're not going to fight. But if they've routed, they've gone off the table, that's it, they're gone. So this is a large departure. But I think it's such a beautiful system. When you play it, it works so well. And it makes sense as well. In real life, if everybody around you is being cut up, you want to run. And something similar does happen in Warhammer, but you have to remove models. I'm getting ahead of myself, I'm going to speak about model removal in the next slide. But suffice to say, at this point already, we can see that we've sacrificed a little bit of complexity here. There are fewer defensive stats. There's no toughness, there's no wounds, and I haven't mentioned armor, but armor is taken into the defense stat in Kings of War as well. So in something like Warhammer, you can have a weapon that will be particularly good against things with high toughness, or something that does multiple wounds, or something that's particularly good at reducing high armor. Likewise, some units can be defensively good in one of those particular areas. And so there's a little bit more subtlety in there. However, by and large, you tend to find there's a high correlation between having a lot of toughness and a lot of armor and a lot of wounds. And the same weapons tend to usually be good at handling all three of those things. So in practical effect, I think that Kings of War really loses very little by using just a straight defense roll, and in return just operates that bit quicker. My next point, which I alluded to, has to do with the lack of model removal and damage reduction in Kings of War. So in Warhammer Fantasy, individual models take damage and they are removed from the table when they fail their saves. Whereas in Kings of War, as I said, there are no individual models so much as there are just whole units. And instead of removing models, you simply add tokens to the unit or have a dice that you use to remember how many points of damage that unit has taken. Now in Kings of War, the damage of the unit does not reduce at all as a result of this. The number of attacks and how often they're hitting is not being changed by how much they've been hit themselves. This has been a point of criticism for some, who've said it's unrealistic to have a unit at the same fighting capacity even after they've sustained some damage, even if they haven't yet fled the table. However, when you compare to Warhammer Fantasy, I think that when you take into account that model removal was from the back, and that you usually would be taking away units, you usually find that your fighting capacity would only really diminish if it got down to the last few models in the unit, or if you had a unit like Spear Elves that had another rank because of spears, and a rank again because of a horde, and then a rank again because of their elven special rules that let them have an extra rank. So by and large, we find that we don't really lose on that much fighting capacity because of the way that model removal works in Fantasy, apart from those cases. And aside from that, it is a really, really convenient system not to have to remove models. From a practical standpoint, models are just damaged less. You know how it is when you've got a unit of 50 spears and you need to take away 3 models, you pick them up and you've knocked over 20 more. Like, it breaks your heart when you do it. So it's just easier in Kings of War, for a start. Secondly, it allows for gorgeous diorama model setups. Looking at the picture I've got here, this is from An Hour of Wolves. I recommend you check out his website because he has a gorgeous undead army, some of which you can see here with a Halloween theme, and he's got resources for playing Kings of War for historical games. But you can see that he's set up his units not just as regular rank and file, but really he's made a diorama out of it. He's used the same footprint of having a number of models, but he has less models there, and he's put in things like fences, like evil-looking pumpkins, little features that make the thing just look gorgeous, which is something that's hard to do in Fantasy. You do get unit filler, but with the basing thing that is done in Kings of War, it's just much easier to do. So, Kings of War, it's convenient, it saves time. I mean, if you played vampire counts, for example, between all of the models that you would put on and take away over the course of a game, it takes a long time to do all that. You can do that with 100 models. More than, especially with zombies. So I think that Kings of War presents a very efficient and time-saving alternative that, in practical effect, does not actually change much from Warhammer Fantasy in terms of the number of attacks being put out. Moving on to charges and combat. Kings of War has fixed charge ranges and pre-measuring. In the past, to my knowledge, I haven't played Warhammer Fantasy in every edition, you would either have a fixed charge range and no pre-measuring, or pre-measuring and a random charge range, as in 8th edition. But Kings of War has both. This has led to the criticism that if you have two armies with identical speeds, say they both have a speed of 5 for most of their units, then you get to a standoff situation where nobody wants to move forward because everybody knows when they're going to be in charge range. And so if everything has moved 5, then everything will stay just out of 10 inches away and no one wants to move forward. Well, this can happen, and I've seen it happen. But if you come into the game with a decent game plan, like you're not just going into the game blundering forward, you will have some sort of idea of what you want to do. You will target what units you want to charge. You will be able to evaluate who has more shooting power here. If you have more shooting power, then you don't need to charge. You can let them come to you. If you don't have more shooting power, then you need to be able to say, well, even if I take a turn of charge damage, then it'll have to be worth it because it's better than staying here being shot. And so in cases where both armies have identical speed, because if there are armies that don't, it's not a problem, the fastest army gets the charge. But if both armies do, and there aren't cavalry elements in there either, or there's no shooting to balance it out. Now that's a lot of ifs. That's both the same speed and equal shooting and equal amount of, or equal lack of fast things like cavalry or flying units. Then it can become a problem. Until someone decides to commit. But by and large I find that one of those three situations is usually the case. Then you get to another perceived problem, that in a combat, in Warhammer Fantasy, you have both sides fighting in each turn. So if it's the second player's second turn, they might charge into combat, then the highest initiative goes first, and the other side fights. So both sides fight in the one turn, whereas in Kings of War, only one side fights in each turn. Well, I don't think this is so bad either. When you think about it, in a melee, they don't rush in and fight for hours. It's an incredibly physically demanding task. So you move in, you fight for a little bit, then you move back, you withdraw, and you charge in again. And this is what actually happened in real life, in this kind of combat. You would fight in what was sometimes referred to as pulses. There would be moments of intensity, then you'd withdraw, and it would be intense again. So I think it works as a good system. It also rewards charging, because whoever charges will get to hit, and will get to do damage. And then we have the ferocity of flank and rear charges. In Warhammer Fantasy, a flank or a rear charge just gives you a little bit of a boost to your combat resolution. It's useful, but not huge. But in Kings of War, it doubles or triples your attacks. The strength of these games, Warhammer Fantasy, Kings of War, is that it makes movement important. The way you position your movement is so critical to the outcome of the game, in a way that other games just aren't. It's the real beauty of it, I think. And what increasing the value of flank and rear charges does is it amplifies that. Because now getting that flank charge is even more important. Doubling your attacks is huge. And that, I think, is another strength of Kings of War. It rewards you if you set up those flank charges. Now we look at magic. There's a lot less magic in Kings of War. A lot less. In fact, if you look at that chart on the right, that's all of the spells. Well, not quite all of them. There is one more. It's called Breath Attack, although that's not strictly a spell. It's sometimes used as a spell, but it's also used as a special rule for weapons that ignore cover. For example, blunderbusses or flamethrowers, that sort of thing. So you have 7 spells in Kings of War. Now you say, well, in Warhammer Fantasy, there were perhaps a dozen laws, and each law had about 7 spells. So we've got nowhere near the variety. And that's true, there is less variety. But, Kings of War, each spell is thought through very well. Each one has a particular role. It's helpful, but it's not overpowered. Because when I think of magic in Warhammer Fantasy, it has its own phase, and it's incredibly swingy. What do I mean by swingy? Well, if every lore, the 6th spell was usually something horrific. So I'm thinking Dwellers Below, Purple Son of Azerius, those sorts of things. You would throw all of your dice at it, you would get some horrific effect, and you would take the best unit on the table off the board from your opponent's side. Or you would miscast, your wizard would die, the unit he was in would die. That's an extreme example, but for being extreme, it still happened in a lot of games. You know, the Horned Rat spell, was it the number 13 of the Horned Rat, whatever it was called, would just, you know, consume a whole unit, or a bunch of a unit, and then replace it with more free Skaven stuff in fantasy. That's not happening here. Here we've got things that are more subtle, well thought through, and they can't be countered. Like, there's no counter magic in this. But I think it's such a well thought through system in terms of you are given a limited amount of things you can do. You can damage enemy units by shooting at them. You can move your own units. You can push away enemy units. You can heal your own units. Or you can give your own units a buff to their damage. And that's it. That simple tool set gives you a lot of flexibility and choice in what you're doing. So if you've got a spellcaster there, is he going to use the damage spell, or is he going to maneuver his troops into a better spot? Again, speaking onto the last slide about the importance of maneuvering, I really think the spells that help to maneuver really do add a lot to the game. For example, Surge is potentially one of the best spells in the game, but I digress. This leads to magic being balanced. You don't pay for a lore, you pay for each individual spell. You see there that's got like Fireball N? Well, N will be whatever number. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 12, 20 in some cases. And when you cast a spell, you roll that number of dice, every 4+ is a hit. It's that simple, it's that straightforward. But in practical effect, it really does matter for the outcome of the game. It's straightforward, it's stripped back, and it does the essentials of what magic needs to do. It can be very important, but it's not game-breaking. You never sit across the table and you think, oh, he just got really lucky with that Fireball spell, and there my entire unit is vaporized. Not like it can happen, but not in the same way as a Purple Sun. Not in the same way as Dwellers Below, where you just think, oh, well, that's useless, I've just lost that enormous thing, and it was pointless, and you curse your luck forever. I think I've said what I need to say on Magic. And this might be the last criticism of Kings of War, that it's bland. People say there are too few special rules, that there's no real fluff to Kings of War, there's not very good lore or background. Not much of it, and what's there isn't very good. Well, I would say that the way that it's stripped back all those special rules is really its strength. It's what's good about it. And you say, what do you mean? All those special rules I loved in fantasy. Yes, but in Kings of War you're doing a very similar thing, but you're doing it without that complicatedness. How many times have you been in a game and you've shot a cannon at something and thought, oh, well, I shouldn't have taken that damage last turn because actually that character had the particular artifact that gives him a 5+ against that kind of attack, and then that monster over there has a bonus against this specific situation, and that thing resists fear tests, but that thing has a thing that overrides that resistance to fear tests. There's a lot less of that kind of exception, counter-exception thing going on in Kings of War. It has something or it doesn't, is usually the case. And then you think, well, Kings of War has a variety of units, but you can't really customize them. Like, I can't choose if I have a standard bearer or a musician or what I equip my champion with. Well, you may be surprised to learn that in Kings of War, you can give each unit a magical item. So, magical items are not just for heroes, they're for each unit. And there are 40 of them you can choose from. And I think that with that, you do get to jazz up your army a little bit. And it does make selection interesting, so you can get something that gives it a movement speed increase, an increase to damage, a reroll to hit. You can give a hero a talisman to give them inspiring, to improve the morale of those around them, those sort of things. And so you do get interesting choices, and you do get variety. Again, it is nowhere near the customization of Warhammer, but I think that, for all that it's sacrificed, it still preserves the flavour and the interesting heart of Warhammer. You still have your trolls, and you have your goblins, and you have your orcs, and you have your undead. Even if you don't have the detailed background, they're still there in the game. And there are some interesting things. For example, the dwarven throwing mastiff. Yeah, like, if the dwarves are throwing a dog at the enemy that goes forward and savages them, you know, that's kind of funny. And the goblins have a big mincing machine. There are just little things like that in the game that are funny. So it's not completely void of all flavour. I'd like to make another point. If you say that Kings of War doesn't really have fluff, that everything in it's very generic, well, I think that actually can be a strength. It's like a canvas that's blank, and you can put your own meaning onto it. I know that I've played role-playing games, D&D, or more specifically Pathfinder, where I have used Kings of War and used the factions in it to represent the factions in the D&D campaign. And it was great, because they already had fluff for a system. So if you think like a role-playing game, if you have the core rules, which doesn't have any particular background with it, like a generic rule set for a system, say fantasy, and then you buy a splat book, which gives you that fluff, gives you that background, well, that works perfectly, and I think you can do the same thing with Kings of War. You can use Kings of War for whatever fantasy world that you're playing. A similar way that, you know, Hordes of the Things does. It's a generic catch-all fantasy system that you can use for any fantasy world. Kings of War does have Mantica, which still needs to be filled out a lot, but you know, it can be your canvas, it can be any system, your own world. And I think that's great as well. So here's my conclusion. Kings of War has preserved the tactical heart of Warhammer, while shedding off all the flab of the special rules. It's gotten rid of so much, it's taken off so much, but what's left is a very streamlined system that at its heart does the same thing. What really matters, the movement, the comparing of hammers and anvils and units with their counters, the use of shooting to deplete units in preparation for charges, that is all there, that is all preserved. The use of magic as an assistant to combat is there, but magic is not overwhelming. Magic is not a be-all and end-all answer, and it's not something that's going to decide games by itself. As a result, Kings of War, it's so smooth. It is buttery smooth to play. It is so quick to play, and it is just as satisfying as Warhammer. And you find that in Kings of War there aren't Death Star units. There's no Kadai Destroyer. There's no unit of, what do you call them? The Palace Guard Elves, not the Palace Guard, that's what they call them, Kings of War. The unit of Phoenix Guard Elves with 3 special characters and Teclis and the Banner of the World Dragon that makes demon armies cry. There's none of that in Kings of War. Everything has a counter that can be used, and if you have an army filled with elite units, they won't have enough frontage and they're going to get flanked. It's just so simple, so elegant. I think all of the things I've taken away, it's easy to mourn what's been lost, but by taking it away, I think we've gained a lot more in Kings of War. That's not to say it's strictly better. I will concede Warhammer gives you a lot more depth in list building. You can fiddle around with Warhammer lists forever. There's so much in there, so many options. And the units do have more flavour. Every unit has a special rule, it seems like. And of course, the lore, which we all love so much in Warhammer. There is so much of it, it's very rich, and it gives the battlefield a bit more context. And those are my thoughts comparing the games. As a side note before I finish, I'd just like to thank everyone for the great response I've gotten to my first video. We're well over 1,000 views now, which I did not expect. And from all the good feedback, I will probably make another report now. I just made the first one as an experiment to see what the reception was like, and it was very positive. Now, there aren't very many Kings of War players around me. I'm trying to evangelise as best I can, but when I can, I will try get games, and when I get games, I will try and make a report. So I'm not going to give any commitment to a schedule, but I'll do the best I can to make more reports for you. Anyway, thank you very much for listening, and have a nice day.